Welcome, everybody who's here. I'm Jeff Satlzman. I'm the CEO of OrgVitality. I'm thrilled and honored to introduce two dear friends of mine, Richard Plenty and Terry Morrissey, who are two guest speakers today and co-authors of the book, Uncertainty Rules, Making Uncertainty Work for You. Before I introduce them, though, I'd like to cover just a couple of housekeeping tidbits. So on your screen, you'll see a little icon that says Q&A. We're going to leave some time at the end for questions. So if, as they present this material, if you have any questions, just enter it into that question box, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation. And we'll respond to as many of these questions as we can at the end of today's session. If we don't get to your question, we can always follow up with you one-on-one and respond to whatever questions you might have had. First, let me introduce Richard. I've known Richard for decades. We're not as young as we both look, but I've known Richard for a long time. Since his time actually in running the Shell employee survey, which is where I met Richard. Richard is currently the managing director of the international organization and development and leadership development practice called This Is. And he's a visiting teaching fellow at Trinity College in Dublin. He started life as a physicist before becoming an organizational psychologist and has lived and worked in Europe, North America, and Asia. Since his retirement from Shell, he's worked at airports since 2005, not as a baggage handler, but as improving the functioning of the airport itself. He's co-authored Airport World's Regular People Matters column since 2014, and his book Uncertainty Rules, Making Uncertainty Work for You, co-written with Terry Morrissey, was published in April of 2020. He enjoys playing the saxophone, guitar, and tennis. Terry Morrissey, our other participant today, is the chairperson of the consulting company This Is, and is also a teaching fellow attached to the Center for Innovative Human Systems in the Psychology Department of Trinity College, Dublin. She is a former Chief Executive Officer of the Psychological Society of Ireland, which is the Irish equivalent of the American Psychological Association. She has extensive consulting experience in major global organizations and is a business and executive coach. She's a principal member of the Association of Business Psychology, a member of the British Psychological Society, an affiliate member of the American Psychological Society, and she co-authors the People Matters column for Airport World and is co-author of the book Uncertainty Rules. One other point I want to mention, in addition to the Q&A, if you have a question, put it in that Q&A box, but don't feel you have to write down everything that they cover. At the end of the session today, we'll be sending you a copy of the slides for your perusal. So with that, let me turn it over to Terry.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I didn't recognize myself there for a minute. I'm very delighted to be here today, and thank you to you and to OrgVitality for inviting myself and Richard to do this presentation today. And the presentation is on uncertainty and based on our book, which you kindly mentioned. So let me start by saying a little bit about some of the more up-to-date things that we've been doing since the pandemic, indeed. And just prior to the pandemic, we got involved with the Global Psychology Alliance, which is an alliance of psychologists around the globe, and was initiated at a summit in Lisbon in 2019, November 2019, and the topic was climate change. And so we're moving into areas like climate change, like how to deal with the COVID pandemic. I'm also involved in the Go Green Routes, which is a Horizon European project for 4 years. I'm chair of the Innovation High-Level Advisory Board on that, and that's a project that's looking at the impact of the green environment and indeed the blue environment on people's well-being, psychological well-being. So you can see, apart from our consulting, we're doing lots of other interesting things and relevant things. We wrote a pamphlet for the airport sector on resilience, which came out last summer in the middle of the pandemic and went all over the world. So we're getting involved in very current issues as well. So we could start the presentation. Richard, I can move on to the next slide. One of the things we did prior to writing this book was we wrote a chapter for a book called Brexit in the Workplace, which was a big source of uncertainty at the time in the United Kingdom. And at that time, for example, just after the results of the referendum, there was a 13% increase in antidepressants. There was a 10% increase in sleep disorders. There was a 20% increase in family conflicts. An article in the American Psychological Association magazine, The Monitor, in 2019 said that the UK Mental Health Institute found 43% of adults felt powerless or helpless, 39% felt angry, 38% felt worried, and also all sorts of other emotions were being given headlines in the British papers and in the Irish papers indeed. So prior to the book, this was going on, and this created quite a high level of uncertainty and indeed a lot of anxiety among people in the UK, but also in Ireland and indeed in Europe, because at that time there was no resolution to this issue. So we wrote our book in 2018, and it was finally published in April 2020, when we were all in lockdown and all the bookshops were closed. So that was a great introduction to this. But anyway, so if we could move on, we've managed to sell a few things online. What we got involved in actually, and that was it was a very interesting time for us, because uncertainty was very much rife certainly in the last 15 months. And we thought we would look at what are the phases in response to a pandemic, because this is a period of high uncertainty. And this is based on some research that was done on the SARS outbreak some years before this. But basically, there's a couple of phases, and I thought it'd be interesting to share this initially with you. There's what's called the active phase. And I don't know if you remember back last February, March time, certainly at this side of the Atlantic, there was an awful lot of people rising to the challenge. We had a clap for the carers every Thursday evening in the United Kingdom. There was a lot of camaraderie, a lot of people doing things together on Zoom. There was a huge increase in the use of virtual reality and in Zoom. And so that was the active phase, was people actually rising to the challenge and coming to terms with it. I think after that, we had a second phase, which was, and I think, we since then, indeed, we've been in and out of these, a bit like a roller coaster, this disillusionment and exhaustion. I certainly know last summer, things started to look like they were opening up. And then back into the autumn and the winter, we were back into lockdown. And indeed, we've been locked down here, certainly in Ireland, since Christmas, since just after Christmas, with it only very, very gradually opening up. And this is a period of high anxiety and high uncertainty for people. In fact, I would go so far as to say people are even wary of doing the kinds of things, even when it does open up, they may even be wary of going back and doing the kinds of things they used to do a year ago. There's a recovery phase. We thought we were in it, but actually we're out of it again. It was very short-lived. And the really own recovery phase will be when people are fully vaccinated, and we seem to have beaten off a lot of these variants. But recovery and the longer term, it should give people a time to reflect. And some people develop personally, but others may feel guilty, resentful. And obviously there's a lot of, there will be, I think, and there is at the moment, a lot of psychological distress and post-traumatic stress syndrome. And I think there'll be a much bigger issue to deal with when we are coming out of this. Probably not until next year we'll really start seeing the impact of this. If we look at how the typical response to a crisis, some of you may be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, in better times, the way that worked was you start at the bottom of the pyramid and you gradually start to fulfill your basic needs, your physical and safety needs. You know, when you have a roof over your head and you feel reasonably safe, you start to move up this pyramid to get ultimately to looking at self-actualization. But when a crisis hits, and when COVID hit, that drove all those needs right down to the bottom of that pyramid. And so a lot of us now are concerned about our health. There's a lot of fear, and there's a lot of social isolation. I know certainly in Ireland, we told everybody over 70 to stay indoors and not to go out at all. That had huge impacts. And obviously quite ageist as well, by the way, because a lot of 70-year-olds are quite fit and active, and probably more fit and active than some 20-somethings, and a lot of uncertainty. So that drove that out, and you know, so hopefully we're looking forward to a recovery, but when that will be is highly uncertain. Okay, so moving on to looking at our uncertainty. Just watch this for a minute, please. Watch the screen. Now, this is, as you can see, this is quite similar to a lot of uncertainty experiences we have. You know, when that picture is unfolding, there's emerging patterns. There's nothing terribly clear. It's very ambiguous, and it's only when you see the full picture, and indeed, this could evolve into even more pictures if we had more time. The picture only becomes clear with hindsight. We start to build patterns looking backwards, and this is very hard, makes it hard to plan. You know, indeed, we've had some clients say to us, how can I plan at the moment? It's very difficult to plan, and what are the tools I can use to make planning, you know, effective? So that's the experience that a lot of us have with uncertainty, and it can of course lead, again, as I said, to anxiety. In terms of looking at some of the things about the world, we believe that the world has become more uncertain. Now, it's not saying it wasn't uncertain in the past, but it's certainly less regimented than it used to be. If you look back at the way the educational system was, we lived in what's called a LAMO world, which was a linear, anthropocentric, mechanistic, ordered universe. Things were much more predictable. A lot of people had jobs for life. We're now in what's called a VUCA world, where things are volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And indeed, there are more questions than answers. We looked at a particular model of uncertainty called the Cynefin framework by Snowden and Boone, which has been around for a number of years. And this is based on systems theory and a number of different types of systems, and the complexity as you go up those steps, things get much more complicated and complex, but they also become more uncertain. So if you look at a simple system, that system is very clear and straightforward. There's a very clear connection between cause and effect. This is a world of procedures. You think of things like microwave meals. You put a meal in the oven, you leave it go for 90 seconds, and out pops your ready-made meal. And that's very straightforward. There's a connection between the instructions and the impact and the effect. And so there's very little uncertainty in that system. If you look at a complicated system, excuse me for a sec. Complicated systems, there is a relationship between cause and effect, but it's not always simple or straightforward to understand. Now, if prior to COVID, if I went to the doctor with a runny nose, watery eyes, a cough, and a headache, she might have said to me, I think you've got a cold or a flu coming on. Now she might say, well, you could have COVID symptoms, you better go for a test. But this is where I need to go to an expert to help me make the connection between some of the things I'm experiencing and what might be the cause of it. The cause isn't totally clear, but there are a few possibilities that it might be. As it becomes more complex, there is some relationship between cause and effect, but it's very hard to see that. It's a bit like the picture we showed you in the beginning. It's only evident in retrospect. And quite often, you know, with complex systems, you don't really understand what's going on until you've had an opportunity to maybe enter into a dialogue, enter into interactions with people, maybe engage other disciplines in what's going on, and get a diversity of thinking around, which was why we think diversity of thought is very important in a complex environment. And indeed, a lot of organizations now and a lot of systems are very complex, and there's lots of variables all interacting with each other. So the more myopic and blurred and siloed my mentality is, the less likely I am to really understand what's going on. So it's really important from an organizational point of view, if we're in a complex system, to have that diversity of thinking. And finally, in chaotic systems, well, it's just chaos. There's you can't really figure it out. You're kind of wandering around in a fog. Sometimes that can be interesting. A lot of creativity can come out of a fog experience, but it's not very sustainable in the long term. Now, what we see happening in these kinds of scenarios is that if something is terribly chaotic, we tend to see something that either we get a lot autocratic behavior coming in, which is to drive down the uncertainty, to say, I know what's going on, I'm going to lead you to the promised land. Of course, I may be totally misguided, and you may be all following me over a cliff. But the thing is, I seem so certain, I seem to know what I'm doing, that you'll follow me. So quite often, autocracy can come out of chaos. And indeed, we're seeing quite a lot of that around the world at the moment. We're seeing a lot of autocratic leaders coming to the fore. But also it can be a world of spirituality where, because it's so chaotic, I kind of let myself go to some other power, and I let myself go with the flow in Buddhist mindfulness, for example. So there may be some spiritual element attached to being in chaos as well. But these are the logical way of looking at complexity and uncertainty. But we have psychological strategies as well, which Richard will talk about in a minute. I just want to finish my piece with something on dilemmas and choices. Uncertainty means hard choices, and I've got to weigh up, you know, should I act now? So have I got patience, or do I want to act straight away? Do I want to rush into something? So quite often there's a dilemma between whether I should act now or wait and see what happens. There's another dilemma which is around whether I should plan or improvise. And sometimes it can be very hard to plan, and improvisation might be better. Can I look at the past, the present, or the future? The past may be no guide whatsoever to what I should do in the future, because what's happened in the past may be totally irrelevant to what might happen in the future. Can I use my intuition or my logic? Or finally, then it could be that I just have to change course, become very adaptable and flexible, or maybe I should stick with something longer and see how it pans out. So these are some of the dilemmas we have in uncertainty.
Okay, so there's a lot of dilemmas. There's a very narrow difference between persistence and stupidity as well. Just looking at the last one, it's just one of the dilemmas we have. So we started to think through what kind of model we could have, or what kind of approach we could have, where we could help organizations and their leaders to really manage and navigate their way through uncertain times. It's not a simple thing to do. And we thought in order to do that, it would be good to, we actually came across a story, I already thought about a story from the past, which really illustrated and started to illustrate and provided a basis for some of our ideas. And it starts off my own thoughts from many years ago. I worked in Canada as an HR manager. It was taken quite a few years ago. I was the retail and commercial HR manager for Shell in Calgary. And it was a fantastic experience. I'd never been there before. I'd lived as an expatriate, but not in that part of the world. And I had a great time. I played in a band, went skiing out to the mountains. There's loads of work. It was great for colleagues, good fun, really, really great. But the thing that really impressed me, aside from all that, was just the vast size and scale and scope of the Canadian environment, and particularly driving across the Canadian prairies on Highway 1. And you go for miles and miles, completely different from anything we have in the UK. You go for miles and miles of flat, unchanging, very unvaried landscape, really. Blue skies, beautiful blue skies, yellow canola flowers, goes on and on. It looks really, really beautiful. And you go through Manitoba and Saskatchewan, Alberta, and eventually ahead of you comes this sheer wall of the Rocky Mountains, rocks just rising from the plains, the weather changing slightly, getting slightly cooler, and clouds and the mountains, just the peaks going into the distance. It's very dramatic. And indeed, when I lived in Calgary, I used to go out and just look on this view on a Sunday morning. It was so spectacular. But then when you get to the mountains, it's an entirely different situation. You know, even in the summer, you can get snow. The weather is variable. You can't predict what's going to happen in the way that you can in the plains. So, you know, the road turns. The mountains look different from every angle. You're never quite sure. Things can change. You can't make your plans so easily. You can skid off the road. It's more dangerous, but it's a bit more exciting as well, because people go more on holiday to the Rockies than they do to the plains, that's for sure, although the plains are very good. But, you know, it's a different environment. And just thinking about that, we thought, what a fantastic metaphor that is for the difference between a stable environment and an environment of uncertainty. Because in that stable environment, you know, when you're driving across the plains, you can just you go on cruise control, really. You know what the weather's going to be like. You know roughly where you're going to get to. There are changes. They're not that great. You can predict what's going to happen. You can plan ahead. When you get to the mountains, you've got to be a bit more circumspect, particularly if the weather changes. And you have to be more alert and more aware, just like you have to do in times of uncertainty. So we took that into an organizational metaphor, and we actually developed a model we called Richmore Model, where we conceptualized uncertainty as really a continuous curve. But at the bottom, you'd have straightforward, quite predictable, stable situations, moving through complicated and complex, volatile, ambiguous situations to at the very top, or the very top level, if you like, things that happen totally by chance, totally random, totally unexpected. And overall, our sense was, although, you know, there's been a lot of uncertainty throughout human history, but if you compare the ability people had to at least try to plan ahead on some kind of basis. I mean, my father had a job for many, many years. He drove into the same place, the same office. And a lot of people had those kind of lives. Now, compared with nowadays, where things can change almost yearly. I mean, we didn't know when we were writing this, our book, in 2 years ago, we had no idea there'd be a pandemic with this degree of uncertainty, which would affect people globally. We had no idea, really, actually, when we started, that Brexit was going to have quite the impact it did have, although we thought that was probably the biggest thing that we would come across in this part of the world. It's the connectivity of things which has probably started to really change and make things more volatile, more complex than they have before. So we started to think, how do you navigate through these peaks of uncertainty? How do you navigate through these ridges of uncertainty? What psychological strategies, what behavioral strategies can you adopt which will help you stay safe in those environments and get through them successfully and make the most of them? So if you take you know, a rugged peak there, and you think, we came up with 5 strategies and 5 behavioral strategies which we noticed and which fit together with navigating through this kind of environment. The first is what we call a defensive strategy. This is where you keep doing the same thing, really. You do nothing different. You continue to act in the same way that you've done before. I was just listening to Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson's advisor at the start of the pandemic in the UK, speaking this morning. And this was a strategy which the UK government used at the start of the pandemic, really pretending nothing had really changed, or perhaps not understanding that something had changed. Because the advantage of a strategy like this, of course, is it doesn't create anxiety because you're still doing what you did before, and it doesn't require much investment in time or anything else because you're doing what you did before. The problem is it doesn't work so well when there is genuine change around, you can then become a strategy of denial. So with all of these strategies, there are pros and cons. So that's the first. It works best when things are stable and predictable, as you might expect. A second strategy is disruptive strategy. It's a very important strategy in times of uncertainty that leaders and others can use. In this strategy, it's really time to change the goalposts, to rewrite the rules. You realize that the current order of things isn't going to be sufficient to carry on. You see the need for change and the need to challenge the status quo. And this is a strategy which has got a lot of energy behind it. It's got action behind it. It's available to people, whatever their organizational level. And social media can amplify this. So it's got energy. It can point you to the right direction. Its problems are that, of course, it can has all the problems of any disruption, that you risk throwing out what's good along with changing what's bad. And it depends also a bit on the motives of those doing the disrupting. I mean, you might like to think as I go through these of examples in your own mind of people you might know or situations you might know that fit all of these categories. But in this particular case, you can have responsible disruption, which is disruption which is done for the good of the whole, or irresponsible disruption, which is very often disruption which is just done with one individual's interests in mind. So that's the second strategy. A third strategy, accepting, works well when really you can't do much about anything. It is really random and there isn't much you can do. So you really cross each bridge when you come to it. This focus in this strategy is to say, well, look, we can only control what we can control, and the only thing we can really control is ourselves. So we're going to concentrate on keeping our cool, keeping our calm, not getting too anxious, and doing all the things, the mindfulness, the breathing, just the general sense of perspective that you need to have that strategy. Maybe the faith, because as Terry said earlier, spirituality also comes into it sometimes. So it's an accepting strategy. At the same time, a strategy like this also lends itself to looking at what's going on in the outside world, observing, monitoring, and just keeping your eyes open so that when something does change, you can make a move. So an accepting strategy is cross each bridge when you come to it. Don't try and do too much, but keep your eyes open. The strategy which happens more often than not, the imposing strategy, get it sorted or get Brexit done, was the example in the UK, is a strategy where you use power really to take control of the situation and put in place a view of what the future should be. And again, this can be done well or not so well. Of course, in organizations, we often impose our views in a constructive way by putting in place processes and procedures and other things which actually reduce uncertainty. But in many situations, what we find is people really putting into place some kind of simplified approach, which really makes things a lot easier, just drives the whole thing down. The advantage of that is that people are less anxious. People quite often quite like it, and it gets things done quickly. The disadvantage is if you happen to choose the wrong thing or people won't follow you, then it can be a pretty disastrous strategy. So it just depends on how it's used. And the final strategy, one which those of us who are scientifically minded rather like, I think, is to take a rational scientific approach where we're really trying to develop hypotheses and test them, try them out, and work to develop a clearer understanding of the situation. Before we then, once we've understood it, it's pretty easy to make things a lot simpler, because we don't have myths and irrelevant things. We know with medicine how well this has worked, where we've more precision with diagnosis, and we know the steps we need to take to make something routine. So this is a rational scientific approach. It's one, would be nice if we could take it all the time, but of course an issue here is that it does take time to do it. It takes investment. It can be hard to do. So these can all come together. Just very quickly, how they come together: if you've not got much control and not much uncertainty, just keep doing what you're doing. If there's a lot of uncertainty and you can't do much, then you might as well accept it. If you have got a bit more time and a bit of control, then it makes sense to start exploring. But if it's a high level of uncertainty, you kind of need to do everything. And what we tried to do was to try and find a way of making this model a lot more understandable by coming back to our metaphor about organizations. So let's go back to what we had in navigating through uncertain times and think, how can we do this and put these together in a simple, practical way that will work whenever we come across the situation of uncertainty, that kind of works and makes sense. And the first thing is, of course, we have methods for doing that when life is stable. Deming came up with the PDCA cycle, so that when we're going through relatively straightforward times, when things are quite predictable, you plan, you check how well things have gone, and then you've adjusted. If you're driving across the plains and you think, I'm going to have dinner at this time, I'm going to arrive at a certain place, then you make your plan, see how long it's going to take. You start, put it into operation. You get to lunchtime, you check, or you check when you're en route that there hasn't been a speed limit or a diversion or something else. You adjust your plans, you phone forward, and then you act and you reach the end. And that works well when you know what's going on. But in the mountains, you need to be more alert, and you need to be conscious of the fact that things may not come on in the same way. Circumstances may change. So we come up with what we call the Richmoor Cycle for that. And that has 4 stages: reflect, strategize, explore, and act. So just go through them one at a time. The first step is to take time out, to stop whatever you're doing, to stop the pace of it and just take time out to reflect. The second is to think strategically. Is what I'm still doing, or what I'm trying to do, does it still make sense in the light of what's happened and what has changed? Does my original purpose still hold? What am I really trying to do? And to look perhaps at different possibilities and different ways of going about things. And then, having done that, to explore, to experiment, to try things out, to test things, to see how they go. And lastly, once we've actually looked at all our options and tried them, then to act. So the trick then is to act very quickly before things change again, but to make sure that we reflect, think through where we are and explore before we actually act. So this can take place in all sorts of situations. It can take place quite quickly, and we can see this working quite well, for example, with Chesley Sullenberger and Jeff Skiles, when they had the plane incident in New York and successfully ditched the plane in the Hudson in 2009. What they had was a bird strike and engine failure, and they used this process instinctively, actually, in a very short space of time. So the first thing is they took time out, a few seconds, to reflect on what had actually happened, and to realize they'd had a bird strike, and to realize actually that had changed everything, because they were unable to restart it. So that they realized pretty quickly that the strategy was no longer just to get to the airport and just to get to the place they were originally going to, but to actually find somewhere to land pretty quickly and pretty safely. So they did strategize and explore the options. They strategized and they looked with the staff, the ground staff, air traffic control, and they had two options. One was to return to LaGuardia and the other was to go to Teterboro. And as they explored those options in detail, they realized that neither of those were really going to work. And the only thing they could do was really to put the plane down on the Hudson, which was the only option available. And then they did that very decisively and very quickly, reformulating everything, their purpose, and acted, and with a good result, and one that was borne out subsequently by experience. So these are really the steps that you can take in a time when there's a great deal of uncertainty, a great deal of change coming on. You have to think, if the circumstances change, is my original purpose correct? Do I need to do something different? What are my options? Let's think through and explore what the consequences are, thinking all the time of the consequences. And then when we do act, to act decisively. So there's an example of that in practice. And of course, in organizations, we find very often, when we see organizations, we find them very often not realizing, a bit like the people in the UK at the start of the pandemic, people don't realize things have changed to start with. So they tend to carry on with the same actions and same activities. They get more and more loaded up. And actually what they really need to do is to take a step back and think, is what I'm doing still appropriate? And then reformulate that to look at what's possible and then to act thereafter. But it's surprising how difficult it can be for people to take that time out. So that's the basic model that we've come up with. It works quite well. It incorporates all those strategies, psychological strategies we talked about earlier, and in a one easy cycle, which is complementary really to Deming's PDCA. So I'm just going to go through these steps, just lastly, go through these steps in just a little more detail and pick out what are the most important things to do in practice with each of them that we've found working with our clients so far. So we take the Reflex Step to start with. What we found is that people really have a great deal of difficulty in taking any time out at all to stop and think. They find it very difficult to get away from operational thinking to think more strategically. There's so many things to do operationally. There's so many activities to do that actually to take time to think of exactly the time out to think of what you really should be thinking about in these sorts of times, when times have changed, you just don't have the time to do it, the strategic elements. And that's because really there's only a certain amount of hours in a day, and there's only a certain amount of time. It's a fixed limit. So we use, this is a simplified version of the example that we use to make the point. And what we say is that this is a time jar. It's like the day. It's a jar which needs to be filled with all the things. And the golf balls are your strategic priorities. And the kidney beans are all those operational activities, of which there's many, many you have to do. And we just ask them, how many do you think you can get into that jar? And it's quite interesting, really. We get all sorts of answers. But actually, the amazing thing is, you can get everything into that jar. All those things will go into that space. And not only that, you can fill it with other stuff as well. We've got the extended version of this has got sand and water. And you can fill the jar even further if you need to, but you can get everything into the jar. But the trick is you have to do it in the right order. You have to put your priorities in first. You have to put the golf balls in first. If you put all the operational activities in first, this is what happens. The golf balls get left behind and there's no room for everything because they just can't fit in. So that kind of flexibility and agility is really important in times of uncertainty. It's really important to know what your priorities are and to make time for that. And the best example we had of that in practice was working with the Dublin Airport Authority. We worked with the chief executive over 7 years, his team, really, where the airport was totally transformed from one of the worst performing airports actually of its size in Europe to one of the top. And if you've been to Dublin, I don't think many people are going anywhere at the moment, but if you've been to Dublin Airport a year or two ago, it was really quite a good place to go. But what he did was he asked right from the start, he said, what I want to do is I want to get my top 15 managers to spend time together, to think about the golf balls, the priorities. And I'm going to carve out time, 2 days, 7 times a year, when we get together and we do nothing but talk about what we're trying to do together and what our priorities are. And he kept that up for 6 or 7 years. And in that time, the place was transformed and revolutionized on every basis. And people didn't like it to start with, but it worked. So the first thing is carve out the time to think. If you can't find time, make the time for yourself to do that. You can't make time for anything really. So the second step was strategize. And Terry.
Okay, so right, so we can move on from that, Richard. It's just a bit of fun. Having a shared vision and a sense of purpose is the key to the second step. And so if you think of a story that I like is the story of 3 bricklayers. And the first one, a guy goes up to him and says, what are you doing here? And the bricklayer says, I'm building a wall. I'm laying bricks. Then the second person he goes up to and he says, what are you doing here? And she says, I'm building a wall. And then the third person, he says, what are you doing? And he says, I'm building a cathedral. And if you have a vision and a purpose of a bigger picture of what you're doing fits in, it's really, really important in terms of giving meaning and value to the work that you do. So I think having that sense of purpose and having that sense of meaning is very important in that second step. So asking yourself the questions of what is my purpose and why am I here and what are we here to do? What am I here to try and achieve? Another story which is I like as well is another piece of work we did with all the local authorities where we did performance management systems we introduced across the whole country of Ireland. We had a series of workshops over a couple of year period. And one of the groups we worked with were what were called outdoor workers, and was a grass cutter. And I said to him, what are you doing? And he said, I'm cutting grass and I really don't like it. I said, why? He said, I've got this tractor and it's very hot in the summer and very cold in the winter. It's a kind of a miserable existence, really. So to re-engage this individual and his team in what they were doing, we said, well, what are you really doing here? What are you really trying to achieve? And through a process of questioning, we got him to reframe and reevaluate what his purpose was. And they were working in a very important visitor center. They had a lot of tourists, a very nice stately house where visitors came to see, and he realized that actually what he was doing was contributing to attracting tourists into not only into the attraction itself, but into the country. And it gave him a much higher sense of purpose and meaning and value in the work that he is doing. And it made a huge difference. And he actually went on to greater and better things in his career when he got out of the rut of I'm just a grass cutter. I think the next step then is to explore.
Okay, and in exploring, trying things out is what's crucial. I mean, exploring, the basis of scientific method really is to try and find out, to set hypotheses, to test them, to try and find things out. And you don't always know from the start exactly what's going to work. Yes, sometimes they go wrong. This particular slide is not a picture of Terry and myself, I don't think. Anyway, I'll move on. This it's a bit like really walking through or walking through the fog, through a mysterious, not quite clear situation in a time of uncertainty. And the fog will clear, but to do so and to go through it, you need to find, you need to really to move forward in a considered manner. And some of the things that you do in this situation, which are appropriate if you're working in an organization, you need to feel the way a step at a time. You need to look for evidence, really important, to actually get the facts and the data as you move forward. Where am I exactly? What information have we got? You need to try things out before just jumping literally into things. You need to make sure you know and have tested a bit. It's important not to rush and to be patient. It's important to build on what goes well, and it's important to take people with you and not got split up. So there's many examples we can give at this. I think the analogy is probably enough at the moment. We can give examples of how that works in practice fairly easily. But the key thing, I think, is that you need to learn as you go. There's a very good book called Collaborating with the Enemy: How to Work with People You Don't Agree With or Like or Trust, by a guy called Adam Kahan, which is pretty much the experience many of us have a lot of the time in complex change, I have to say. But you can't avoid that. It's just the way life is when you do something with a lot of different people and on a grand scale. But it's important to realize that, you start off with something, some of it gets done, not everything will get done, but the key is also how you integrate other stuff along the way in order to achieve what you want to achieve. So you need to learn as you go. And the other thing I think that we've found that's really different from linear change, which I spent a lot of my early life working on, where it was all planned change and you had a vision and the starting point and everything else, is it's much more messy than that in a time of uncertainty. And it gets quite emotional, and you have to keep control of how you feel. We've done this picture of emotional challenges during uncertainty, which I think really corresponds to how a lot of people we talk to feel. You start off with a great idea, you're energized, and then typically things change, the reality dawns, and your mood drops. This is very typical, and then you go through a period which we've called the struggle, where you're getting on with your day job, but nothing is really necessarily working, and you're having to deal with all the uncertainty and disappointments that you get when things don't quite work out as you'd initially planned. You need persistence, resilience, mental toughness. Then if you come through all that, your mood can go up. You can be really successful. It's fantastic. You can spread that to other people. Or another way to cheer yourself up is simply to give up. And sometimes that is the right thing to do. And just learn from the thing and start again, start the process again. So either can work. Obviously, if you're successful, that's best. Just one thing that I mentioned here, in order to deal with that struggle, you don't have to make a drama out of a crisis, as it were. I mean, there are lots of things that can be certain. Dealing with the struggle, it's good to have a routine, and it's good to stay connected with people. It's good to simplify things where you can. I mean, during this pandemic period, Terry and I have regularly talked to each other at a certain time every day, stayed connected. We've had even more connection than normal, as it were, because we just need to, and keep things simple. Most important is to keep a sense of perspective and humor, because if you don't do that, you won't take people with you, and that's really unfortunate. It doesn't work well. So that's to explore, and then we come to the final step, to act. Oh no, we don't. We just have to say that sometimes things don't work out, but it's a learning opportunity when they don't. And Dyson provides a very good quote on that. So once you've been through that process, the final step, to act. Terry?
Could you move the slide on? Thanks. I'm just conscious of the time, so I'll just quickly go through these couple of slides to give people an opportunity to ask some questions at the end. I think that a very important step, and this is where a lot of people dither and founder and faff about, is to act, and to act decisively. And making sure when you act that you've picked your time, you have a plan in place, and you've thought through the consequences, and you've got your allies in place. So this is all part of the acting phase. The story that we tell is of Shackleton and his voyage, where he had to make a decision, a hard decision, to abandon the ship and to proceed on foot. But once he made up his mind, he just acted straight away and acted decisively. One of the couple of things, next slide please, the couple of things that you have to do in acting decisively is it's very important to, one of the things that I find very important is to deal with the naysayers. There'll always be people there who will try and stop you, or will have a reason why it shouldn't be done, or are just being plain obstructive. And Shackleton dealt with those very, very clearly, and I suppose in an imposing manner in that respect. But sometimes you do have to do that, particularly if you've gone through the previous 3 steps and you're quite convinced now that this is the right way to go. You really haven't got time to dither or to waste time really when you need to act. It also requires courage, because the courage to actually take that step into the unknown. It really is a very important characteristic to have. And of course, when you do succeed, it's very important not to dismiss that success, but to celebrate that success. So there are the 4 steps. In summary, you need to reflect, you need to strategize, get your sense of purpose, explore some of your options, look at your options, and then when you've made up your mind, then act. So the final piece we want to talk about is just some of the competencies that you require to make this happen. I'm Irish, as you probably gathered from my accent. So this is the shamrock, the Irish symbol, which we've used to describe the different types of competencies that you need. Usually competencies come in three areas, and we've added a 4th, which is the stem of the shamrock. So you need thinking strategies, thinking competencies, which are seeing the big picture, critical thinking, really, really important these days, and particularly in times of uncertainty. Don't just accept what you hear at face value. Check it out, seek the data, use your exploring strategy. It's very, very important to maintain your sense of skepticism sometimes around things. It's a good time for innovation and for thinking in big picture systems, because a lot of the issues at the moment are complex and global, and they require global strategic thinking. The second one is on the relationships, and collaboration and teamwork, even more important as we're faced with more uncertainty and more complexity. Issues are not just in isolation anymore. There's lots of multifaceted and multivariable issues going on, and it's important that we keep our relationships. And some of the key skills here are influencing and persuading. And then on the self-management piece, obviously what Richard was talking about, managing oneself, managing one's emotions, taking personal responsibility is really important. And one thing that I always find helps me out a lot is having a sense of humor, a sense of fun. If you can't laugh at yourself now and again, it's a poor sign. Sometimes things are just absurd, and having that sense of absurdity and a sense of humor around things, I think, can help us through some of the darker times. However, I don't lose sight of some of the real issues, but having a sense of humor. I was known in the Psychological Society of Ireland for my dark sense of humor, even around the most tricky situations. I always managed to find some sort of a fun joke that kind of broke the ice and broke the tension. And I think you can make a distinction between jocular humor and jugular humor. Need I say any more? And finally, the core. Who am I? What's my character? That old term we use, character. What sort of a character is he or she? And what values do they stand for? I'll leave you with a few tips. And these are, the first one is I think very important, and is take personal responsibility. I can't blame the government. I can't blame other people. I can't blame a lot of people for my situation. I can do things to influence things, but I am responsible. I'm a responsible agent, and I can do certain things within my sphere of influence. The second one is to have a clear sense of values. What do I stand for? And they will guide me through any difficult time, having a sense of purpose and value. And the third one is very important as well. And these are principles, really, I suppose, rather than tips. What can I control? there are certain things that I can control, and certain things that are just outside of my control. I can control my response to the situation. Resilience is built up through me controlling what I can control and controlling myself. And finally, a tip that some people have found very helpful is don't underestimate the power of enduring relationships with people you trust. And so that's our talk, and thanks very much for those of you who stayed with us. And you can see there we also have we're multi time and motion and videos. We have a music video which will go with the slides, so which Richard and some colleagues wrote. So if you want to have a look at that afterwards, feel free to do so. I hope you enjoy it. And thanks very much, OrgVitality, for having us here this evening. Or at lunchtime in your time, sorry, evening where we are.
Thank you very much, Richard and Terry, for a wonderful presentation. Just a few quick points for those folks here. You will be getting copies of the slides after we're done. And as you exit, there will be a short little survey. We'd appreciate if you'd fill it out about the length and the material content. Helps us improve for the next time. We just have just a few minutes left. So I just wanted to ask a couple questions, if that's okay. I think we're only going to have time for one or two. But I think the first one I'd like to ask is, so how are things now in the UK and in Ireland? Are people still working from home? Are you guys getting out? Are you in isolation, or what's going on in Ireland, Terry?
Well, we're still in lockdown, Jeff, and there's no official return to the office. I think people will be going back probably around September time. That's the latest we have. I'm working from home. I have been since last March 2020. And there's very little, there's no pubs open, sorry, so no pints of Guinness.
No pints.
No pubs open. The only shops open are supermarkets and essential shops. But it's starting to ease up a little bit, and we have very draconian rules here about traveling. So you know, I think we Irish people have been rather stoic actually so far, putting up with all this.
Yeah. And Richard, how's the UK handling it?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. One thing I've noticed is there's quite a lot of people who haven't really ever worked from home. I mean, I've got, my kids are, a lot of them are doctors or nurses or physios and things like that. And they've had to work in the same way. And they've been working the last year, as indeed many people have and had to do in a number of jobs. So there's that group of people which have just had to carry on working. But I think for most people, we're further ahead in the vaccination program. People are going back to work a bit, but I was in London yesterday. It's really deserted compared with what it was. I think people in the UK are very keen on working from home. I don't see them returning to offices and cities in the same way as the past. And I think it's going to be a blended kind of experience with people demanding some degree of flexible working actually going forward. And, you know, working on the private stuff, quite a lot of people will, where they can, will work on individual stuff at home, and they'll use the opportunity to go to the office to work with others and collaborate. So I think we're going into a different style, and there's a lot of enthusiasm, I think, particularly in the UK, for a more flexible way of working.
But in both Ireland and the UK, are things getting better now?
Yes, they are. They're starting to open up, yeah. And
Okay.
we've got a vaccination program, which is very slow to start with, but it's picked up.
Good to hear.
Yeah,
well,
much better here.
We are out of time. You will be getting a copy of all the slides, and I'd just like to thank you, Richard. Thank you, Terry, for agreeing to do this. It was a wonderful presentation, and thank you for all the participants who came. And with that, we will sign off. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.